We're going to follow the same format that we were using before. I'll ask Catherine to start us off, giving a brief introduction to herself as the discussant, and then we'll have each of the three panelists give an 8-minute introduction and sort of recap of the ideas that they want to highlight from yesterday, and then we'll turn it back to Catherine. So with that, Catherine.
One thing that I love about SFI is that you have a couple just meta kind of level themes that tend to weave their way through almost every conversation regardless of the specific topic at hand, and I think today we'll see some neat examples of that where you can kind of deepen and broaden your knowledge as the day goes on. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm on the board at SFI, have been for some time, have been a groupie for much longer. I'm an investor by profession, and in particular, I've been working increasingly in the field of sustainable and impact investing the last decade plus now. And what that means is there's sort of this great reconnection ethos that is coming to bear. I see it almost every context, every company I look at, every academic discipline, a lot of what's happening at SFI, and finally at long last in finance. This idea that, finance is not a separate independent system that can be cut off from the rest of the world, but actually has always been and continues to be this iterative back and forth small piece of a much more great whole. As you might expect, that practice raises a lot of the issues we've already talked about today, such as this push and pull between wanting something that is really simple and fits tidily on a spreadsheet versus wanting something that actually is worthwhile and makes sense and is of value and somehow relates to the true question at hand. These are not simple things, and so we can talk through some examples of those. But what I love about SFI is it gives you a way to get to better questions at the very least, and that in and of itself is a massive victory that should not be understated. So that's where I fit in terms of my own background. Again, this theme of asking better questions, of kind of reconnecting things we have falsely disconnected in our analysis is top of mind for me. And I will say, just as a bridge to biology, since we have a couple biological perspectives on this panel, I do have this vision of finance as like a mycorrhizal fungi. And I love this metaphor. I talk about it at great length. It turns out most of my colleagues don't like to be compared to fungus. And so it has its limitations, but we will, it's the greatest compliment I could come up with. They would rather be, sharks or, lions, some kind of apex predator usually comes to mind. And I am trying my great life's work really. Exactly. This is my number one sort of like philosophical goal as an investor is to convince all of my colleagues like you would rather be a fungus than a lion. And so. Organism in the world. And most powerful by almost any measure. So there you have it. And this is maybe the only crowd where I could say that, and everyone's like, yeah, of course, as opposed to what the hell are you talking about? So that is my work. My day job is Putnam Investments. I'm the head of sustainable investing. I manage 2 large mutual funds there, about $5 billion in assets. I deal a lot day in and day out with leadership teams at large public companies. So there's the perspective from the operating company point of view as well that I'll try to bring to today. So with that, we'll do just what we did this morning, some quick recaps and kind of condensed versions of some provocative scientific ideas, and we'll weave that into conversation from there. You went first yesterday.
Do you want me to go?
Do you want to go first?
I don't. Do you want me?
I wish
do you want to
Albert go first.
You go, Albert.
I feel
go.
like he got changed yesterday. You took a lot of his ideas yesterday.
That's because he's been hanging around me. I mean, he's like plagiarizing all the time.
Well, I'm gonna plagiarize now. Hi everyone, I'm Albert Gao. I'm an Omidyar fellow at the Institute. Pretty new. I joined in September. So I think it's clear to all of us that there are several crises that our species faces now and in the next century, which can only be solved through global collective action, which we've talked about already today. And I would argue that these problems are largely, if they're solved, they will largely be solved through our social networks, since it's on these networks that information is shared, opinions are communicated, and hopefully some consensus is formed about these issues. And these social networks can be either physical, like geographical, or they can be digital. And we've talked about like Facebook and Twitter a little bit already. I guess the key point that I want to make is that the digital social networks on which information currently spreads is not optimized for good decision making. and it's not optimized for efficient, positive information spread. Instead, it's optimized for profit maximization by the companies that own them. And we've also already talked a little bit about how these networks are vulnerable to being gamed by different corporations or by governments. But since these social networks are the main communication platform that we as a species has available to us, we should think a little bit about how we can improve it to actually align the dynamics and capabilities of these networks to serve our needs. So good decision making. In 1985, Michael Soule wrote this article on conservation biology and framing that field in what he called a crisis discipline. I'll just read a couple sentences from that article. So he described, let's see, gotta zoom in. Okay. Conservation biology differs from most other biological sciences in one important way. It is often a crisis discipline. This is analogous to surgery. It's like surgery is the physiology and war is the political science, as conservation biology is to ecology. A conservation biologist may have to make decisions or recommendations about design or management before he or she is completely comfortable with the theoretical and empirical basis of the analysis. Tolerating uncertainty is often necessary. So one argument that I and collaborators of mine are making is that the study of social networks and collective behavior in general ought to be framed as a crisis discipline as well, where we're still arguably at the early stages of understanding how social networks work, but given the situations that we're in, we need to start making recommendations despite this imperfect knowledge. One important point I want to make is that humans didn't evolve in the context in which we now live. So the social networks we're living in are vastly larger than the ones we evolved in. And so it might be useful to look at other social networks that have evolved in order to be adaptive and robust, and that's by looking at other species. So some of my work looks at some of these species. So classical systems include honeybees and ant colonies, and more recently people have started to study fish and birds and primates and other species in more detail, and that's largely driven by new technologies. So you can put GPS trackers on birds, or you can use video cameras to make 3D pictures of how flocks of birds move around. And I would also extend this to things like fungi, which are also networks that communicate amongst itself and makes decisions about where to grow. And so I think in the future, we need a general understanding of how these networks across systems and across species behave. And these systems differ in how they're structured, so the network structure, as well as the capabilities of the nodes themselves, whether that's a human or a fish or some part of a fungus. What kind of information flows through these networks? And also how related are the components of the networks. So in ant colonies, for example, the workers are all sisters. So there's different incentives in that kind of structure compared to, say, a school of fish where the individuals are not related. So how do you minimize conflict and maximize cooperation in those kinds of networks? And also in different contexts. So for example, if you're running away from a predator so if you're running away from a predator, you want to make a very rapid decision, which might be less accurate. But if you're trying to migrate north, you want to be super accurate and might want to take more time to make that decision. And so there's what's called a speed accuracy trade-off, which we talked a little bit about yesterday. And the kinds of strategies might be different depending on where along that axis you want to be at. So I think we need to think about what kinds of rules on these social networks work for different kinds of tasks, like different parts of the speed accuracy trade-off. Do you need different rule sets for different contexts, or can you have one rule set that works across many contexts where you just have to tune the parameters of that rule set to work in different contexts? And so to bring it back to humans, I think we need to frame it as a crisis discipline, and one productive approach could be to look across very broadly at different biological systems and see how do they differ from human systems, how are they similar, and how do different systems achieve robustness, adaptiveness, and effectiveness.
I'm Jessica Flack. I'm a professor at the Santa Fe Institute, and I work on the origins of biological, social, and social space and time through the lens of collective computation. So that's how nature solves problems. And I could spend my time telling you what collective computation is and where it's going, but in the spirit of the meeting of looking forward 50 or 80 years, I'm instead going to say a bit about what collective computation might make possible. So, as I see it, we humans are at an intersection, and the convergence of ideas and events at this intersection is just coming into focus. And they're significant enough that for human and possibly planetary history, this might be a critical or a tipping point. But before we can sort of stretch the limits of our collective imagination to consider what future history could originate from this moment in time, it's worthwhile to consider the nature of the convergence. So what is the convergence? Well, as I see it, it's the rise of AI and machine learning, collections of vast quantities of microscopic data, climate change itself, and the rise of megascience around that and getting to Mars. And most importantly, and I really didn't stress this yesterday, and I want to stress this as the most important thing, a growing but still naive understanding of the mechanics connecting micro to macro that is coming out of complexity science. And what inadvertently and unplanned sits at the intersection of these developments is the possibility of a quantitative theory of control, of relatively, and I mean relatively, precise, proactive, or anticipatory social and environmental engineering. So, in Red Mars, in the chapter called Falling into History, Kim Stanley Robinson wrote, societies without a plan, that was history so far. But history so far had been a nightmare, a huge compendium of examples to be avoided. Now, of course, humans have been attempting to engineer social outcomes since the dawn of cultural history, and there are many great examples. In his book, Priests and Programmers, Steve Lansing, who's on the external faculty of SFI, describes how a Balinese water temple system emerged in the 9th century to optimize planting cycles and water distribution. And then there's a Rube Goldberg-like device, a voting process for electing the Doge, described beautifully by Norwich in A History of Venice, that was invented somewhat cooperatively by Venetian families in the 1500s to prevent the election of the Doge from being gained. These are great examples of social engineering. And they're surprisingly elegant, but they differ from canonical examples of engineering manufacturing plants and cars and spaceships in that, so far, there's no blueprint for social systems, no quantitative way to rigorously identify targets of interventions that will reliably produce or control change. Rather, the history of human, social, and financial and ecosystem engineering is largely based on intuition, as Jeffrey said earlier, heuristics or rules of thumb, and qualitative data about what variables are important, derived from noisy estimates of regularities made on finite and idiosyncratic personal data sets and experience. As Isaac Asimov wrote in the essay, The Planet That Wasn't, people are entirely too disbelieving of coincidence. That they are far too ready to dismiss it and build arcane structures of extremely rickety substance in order to avoid it. I, on the other hand, see coincidence everywhere as an inevitable consequence of the laws of probability, according to which having no unusual coincidence is far more unusual than any coincidence could possibly be. I think that's an important quote to keep in mind. So perhaps consequently, the majority of attempts to engineer adaptive systems have been disastrous, especially those that did not have the benefit of developing organically over a long time period, as self-organization and long time scales can sometimes compensate for cruddy intuition. Mm-hmm. We might call the past history of social engineering reactive, and the future can in principle be proactive. Irritating some people in the room.
Do it again.
If we can in fact successfully infer the rules and strategies that individuals use to guide decision making, we will have a robust starting point for building predictive simulations of social outcomes at the societal level. Such simulations will allow us to test alternative futures and give a quantitative empirical basis for our intervention decisions. Now, the potential power of this approach seems obvious, I think. As further testimony to that, to its apparent obviousness, one only has to look at the huge investment by Google, Facebook, and other companies, and all the third-party companies that have grown up around this, data merchants as they're called, that deal solely in data sales, or to China's social credit program. So it seems obvious, but amazingly, just 10 years ago, there was little discussion outside of science fiction novels of this growing reality. I'm not saying that social engineering hasn't been there in the past. As I explained, there's been plenty of it, but it's been qualitative. So take the Facebook election debacle. Even if it's overhyped, it's an example of just how poorly we collectively anticipated that change from reactive to the beginnings of a proactive quantitative science of social engineering, and how rapidly those initial stages might in fact progress. So is there going to be a giant leap forward in proactive social engineering that allows the orchestration of very precise social outcomes at the individual or societal level? Probably not. There are two reasons for this, probably others as well. It's unlikely. Human behavior is probabilistic. There's a lot of stochasticity, and there's also stochasticity in the process by which behavior combines to produce society. So even if scientists had the best data and methods at our disposal, complete prediction would never be possible because of the character of adaptive systems. Adaptive systems are imperfect computers with many coupled time and space scales. They're error-prone sensors making estimates based on noisy and finite data. That's just the nature of things. And then there's the changing environment. So one might respond to this pessimism by suggesting social engineering would reduce behavioral variance and in that way eliminate much of the noise. But this view is naive, and it brings us to the second reason why social engineering will never rival standard engineering in its predictive power. So adaptive systems are just that. They're adaptive. Actors respond strategically as the system and environment changes in evolutionary learning time, meaning that the metrics used to gauge adaptation become targets. And when they become targets, they cease to be good metrics. This is Goodhart's law, and it applies when timescale separation between the micro and the macro is too small or small. Social engineering may, in fact, make social systems more complicated, not less complicated, and even less predictable. And that's if these engineering arms races get out of control. Timescales become highly coupled. So perhaps a way around this is for social engineering to focus on process, on creating robust systems with good timescale separation that ensure some predictability, maybe that benefits us all, that predictability, even if the particular nature of the outcomes doesn't, over orchestrating specific outcomes like the degree of inequality. That's something to think about. So what's much more likely than tight control, and I think Jeffrey made some comments along these lines earlier, is coarse, robust prediction based on an understanding of the dominant causes at the mesoscale. This is illustrated by a recent study in Science on collective behavior, in particular the collective behavior of marathoners, the collective motion of marathoners. And this is, of course, a quantitative study, and it found that the large-scale motion of runners could be predicted without knowledge of individual interaction rules if the crowd was modeled as a fluid. The question for social engineering, the reason I bring this up, is can we build societies that are like fluids so that we can predict and control aggregate behavior without having to know or caring what the individuals are doing? Assuming that such models work when the range of individual behavior is large and varied, which is not the case for marathons, this would resolve many problems concerning individual collective trade-offs, privacy, autonomy, and the like, and might allow social engineering we can all contribute to cooperatively and adversarially as our local needs dictate. Another thing to think about. So far in this talk, I've crudely sketched an image of what might be possible, and now I'd like to spend just a few minutes thinking about what it will take to move from the rich ideas that we put on the table that are in the Mars trilogy and other books like it to concerted progress. And I'm going to make what might seem like a big leap, but hopefully you'll see that it's not. So I'm a big believer in foundational science, and I think if we're going to make real progress on engineering controlling or nudging, the more gentle take, on social outcomes, we have to understand, to some yet unspecified degree of coarseness, the mechanics of macroscopic state transitions in adaptive systems. Stepping back further, we need a theory for the emergence of biological space and time. We all sort of know this. And somewhat more specifically, how the macroscopic world emerges from microscopic interactions with the important addition of stressing in information processing systems. So let me use some observations to explain why the information processing emphasis is so important. Physics or physical systems are dominated by concepts like pressure, temperature, and entropy, and they emerge from relatively simple collective interactions among particles and provide deep insight into the behavior of the universe. And there's a long history of looking for law-like behavior in physical systems, which often starts with the question, do we observe predictable relationships at the macroscopic scale? And then it proceeds to ask, are these variables fundamental? Can they be derived from the microscopic? And if so, we can say they're law-like. The ideal gas is an example. This is, of course, a bit of a caricature, but it's a caricature that serves to ground the discussion as we move to consideration of adaptive systems. So biology, to include society, makes use of comparable collective concepts, metabolism, conflict management, and robustness, but unlike in physical systems, these are functional concepts. Physical systems produce order through the minimization of energy, and adaptive systems have the addition of information processing. Adaptive systems produce order through the addition of noisy, error-prone information processing. And why there's this extra step is actually an open question. Whether it makes them fundamentally subjective, uncharacterizable by laws, and unamenable to fine prediction is a debate that motivates pretty much all of the research at SFI. So a natural question from my perspective is to ask, how does nature overcome subjectivity to produce ordered states? Subjectivity is the key point there. And our proposal is that adaptive systems overcome subjectivity by collectively estimating regularities and collectively computing solutions to environmental time, just another minute or so, in evolutionary and learning time. Now there are several intertwined issues in that proposal that I want to bring forward. And the first concerns the nature of computation in biological systems. What constitutes a computation? What are the essential elements? Under what conditions can the computation be refined over evolutionary and learning time to produce an increasingly adaptive output? By which I mean an output that minimizes uncertainty about the future. In other words, what we want is a compact encoding of that micro to macro map, or an algorithmic theory for the output that identifies those dominant causal features contributing to functional macroscopic states, and that is the basis for making intervention decisions. We can also ask questions like, are there limits to the kind of things that can be computed? Are there general principles describing collective computation across scales? Are some types of computations easier than others, like those that stress particular outcomes, like the degree of inequality, versus those that stress dynamical things, like distance from the tipping point? Now, the second trajectory is epistemological. What are the right approaches to studying micro to macro maps in information processing systems when computation's error-prone and so forth? One big difference between information processing in adaptive systems and those dominated largely by energetic concerns, which is also true for some parts of biology, and the scaling work of Jeffrey is an example, is that the system's point of view must be considered. So much of my work is devoted to understanding how regularities perceived by the components develop. And so how does the system itself come up with its own effective theory for how the world works? What we're suggesting is to answer this question, to figure out how to do interventions, we need to know that. Okay, so to do this, we believe that to do this well, we have to bring concepts together from statistical physics, cognitive science, evolution, dynamical systems, theoretical computer science, and information theory. And in some sense, what we're after is what might be called a strategic statistical mechanics for information processing systems, and that is a very long timescale goal. I'll end by saying that my research focuses on what can be computed or engineered and how it is computed. And I didn't address here, and I don't really address in my work, whether we should engineer social systems. In other words, from the point of view of normative ethics, or how we decide what to engineer. However, I do know that the question of should would be more interesting and useful if it took seriously the science of collective computation that in principle can tell us what is in the realm of the possible.
Breathe in. There's a lot. I sort of feel I just have an argument with Jas about her talk. It would be, but perhaps that's what the room will do. And so, okay, so mine will be less weighty than those. So I work on the evolution of intelligence and stupidity on Earth, and arguably stupidity is a more important problem than intelligence. And yet, I've often wondered why there aren't university departments, right? I mean, and it's vanity, right? It's sort of everyone would like to be the intelligence professor, but no one would like to be the stupidity professor, the stupid professor. So, but it's an important topic because I operationally define these as intelligence, just so everyone knows and leaves the room with what intelligence really is, as opposed to all the wishy-washy stuff that's going on in the world. Intelligence simply means, in comparison to an appropriate null model for a given function, above null performance. And stupidity means, in comparison to appropriate null model, worse than null expectation. So for example, if you're investors and you're outperforming a random algorithm, you can call your strategy intelligent. If you're being outperformed by an index fund, you're stupid. And I hate to tell you this, but it's true. And so that's basically how I think about it, and you can apply it.
headquarters.
That's fine. That's my job. And so, but it's an important point to note. I mean, if you aren't, you're really, you probably shouldn't be in that profession. Okay. So, having said that, given that that's what intelligence and stupidity is, ignorance, by the way, is interesting because you can define it in this framework, because ignorance is simply insufficient data under conditions of stupidity or intelligence, right? So if you're applying rules with insufficient data, you might not outperform the null simply because you don't have enough data for your algorithm to work. So ignorance is a more forgivable. So what I wanted to just point out is what I think are several areas that are evolving very quickly and have been doing so over the last decade or so that should change our attitude towards intelligence very broadly, and that has implications for application that we can discuss in this panel. And I'm going to list them and tell you briefly what they are. So first of all, collectives, our understanding of collectives. The other one is our understanding of artifacts, and in particular cognitive artifacts. The third is our understanding of non-human nature. And the final one will be machines. And I think our attitude to all of those have changed very quickly and should be. And it's a synthesis of that sort of constellation of ideas that constitutes my research agenda. So collectives, so much of our understanding of intelligence comes from the study of individuals and the study of human individuals. And so psychology is one of the most anthropomorphic disciplines, even though there is comparative psychology that looks at non-humans, but typically a few model systems. Our understanding of intelligence is deeply non-Darwinian. Any test of a universal biological property that can only be measured in one species is anti-Darwinian. That's why the IQ test is ludicrous from a comparative perspective, even though it might have grounds in our understanding of working memory. Collectives are even more intriguing because everyone in this room, 99.9% recurring of what you know you did not discover or invent yourself, you acquired from the collective. You acquired from history. And yet, for some reason, that sort of 10 to the minus 100th of your contribution to the world's intellectual store is the thing that we emphasize. And it's quite interesting. Education, pedagogy is the one field that understands that. The rest of us don't seem to understand it. So intelligence is fundamentally collective. And just to be clear, if you know how to speak, if you know mathematics, you are smarter. There is no notion of innate aptitude. It's another myth that we can discuss at length. So to know, to have in your possession tools and techniques that amplify what your neural system can do is to make you smarter, not to make you just more knowledgeable. And we can debate that. Artifacts. I mean, we live in the age of cognitive artifacts. I mean, we talked about cell phones. I have a particular interest in mechanical artifacts like the abacus, like the slide rule, and trying to trace the history of inferential machines up through to digital artifacts. And the key concept that I play around with is the notion of artifact transparency, which gives rise to two different kinds of artifacts, what I call complementary cognitive artifacts and competitive cognitive artifacts. Complementary cognitive artifacts are things like mathematics and writing and the abacus, where once you have learned how to use them, when you put them aside, you maintain the skill that they have augmented. Competitive cognitive artifacts are the ones that when you have become accustomed to using them and you cast them aside, you are worse. And so a GPS system is a competitive cognitive artifact because everyone in this room knows, and I'm foremost amongst them, that if I get used to using them, I entirely lose my spatial ability. Whereas using maps are very fascinating, and there's very interesting cognitive literature on maps, you internalize them. So if you've looked at a map for long enough, you no longer need it to be in your hands. It's a very different principle, and that can be mathematized, and I try to mathematize it through the concept of artifact transparency. Nature, non-human nature. We have been living under an illusion. This is now where I get my pulpit. And the illusion of human supremacy, defined largely on the grounds of the attributes that are unique to our species. But just go swimming with a dolphin, or go skydiving with a condor, right? All species are unique. That's what makes them species. To say that our species is unique is a platitudinous tautology. The question is, can we extend our understanding of intelligence, which, as I have defined it, is a cognitive process that gives you above control performance, to other forms of inference that aren't analytical? And of course we should, because we're obsessed with autonomous vehicles and robots, and their form of intelligence is motion and not mowing us over, not playing Go, which we actually as a society don't give a shit about. Even though it's interesting and curious as an entertainment, it's not really that foundationally important, let's be honest. If you could build a robotic wasp that could fly around and dust your apartment, you'd be vastly more interested in it than in a Go computer. And the reason why this matters, this comparative perspective on intelligence, is because what's been happening with machine learning. The history of unsuccessful artificial intelligence is a history of trying to emulate human symbolic reasoning. The history of successful artificial intelligence, called machine learning, is emulating the true structure of evolved nervous systems, right? So deep neural networks, convolutional neural networks, do not take a page out of the history of human logic. They take a page out of the history of the evolution of nervous systems. And I would claim that there's huge untapped potential for companies interested in building intelligent systems in learning from non-human nervous systems, particular in the domain of motion, robotics, and so on. And I think perhaps the most interesting issues have to do with combining these. That is, the hybrid society that we're moving towards, where we are collectives, where collectives enabled by inferential artifacts that are running machine learning algorithms founded on quasi-neural principles. And so I guess our research is trying to understand that nexus, and for the purposes of this panel and this session, what that might mean for investors and for impact on the world, to include some of the thorny problems that were discussed this morning.
Hooray! This is gonna be so great. Okay, so let's start weaving together, and we'll turn pretty quickly to audience engagement here. I have 2 or 3 questions that could go in lots of different directions. So intentionally, kind of big, open-ended questions, and I'll just start by emphasizing the backdrop. And I think this is not just the backdrop for investing; it's the backdrop for a lot of our professional lives, which is we tend to massively overvalue confidence and precision. And in the absence of true, warranted confidence and actual accurate precision, we will happily take false confidence and false precision over uncertainty or a declaration, I don't know, which is often the more honest and truly valuable answer. And so there's this massive bias in most of our processes, most of our decisions, the way most of our tools have evolved towards having confidence and precision, false if necessary, above and beyond anything that is more complete, but also a little more uncomfortable. So we're going to start and end with that kind of deeply human note, this question of discomfort and how it weaves throughout the scientific questions that are before us today. The first thing I'd really like to dwell on is this question of variety of intelligence. And David, you touched on it. Albert, you touched on it as well, this idea that we have a pretty human-centric, and even within the scope of human-centric, also a very narrow definition of intelligence. I'm especially curious about how this relates to our characterization of systems and problems and questions in the first place. So again, just coming back to my hometown, one of the biggest issues with finance is that we tend to characterize it as a physics-oriented system, right? All of our models are based on physics, and not just that, they're based on physics from like 1930. And if you fast forward, again, you get confidence, you get precision. The problem is the foundation is a really flawed foundation. The actual system is much more of a biological system. But boy, that's messier. We don't have the tools. I can't plug it into my algorithm just yet. So I'd love for you to talk about maybe some examples in your own work that thought through this question. What are the varieties of intelligence that we want to bring to bear in this question? And given the variety of intelligence that's out there, how can we maybe define a better question? Open.
I don't know if David would agree, but I mean, I guess like one tractable way to think of intelligence is to think of specific tasks. So if you look across nature, like different animals or organisms are good at different things, or like are better than humans at different things. So there's experiments with chimpanzees where if you flash numbers like 1 through 10 on a screen for like a fraction of a second, they can really accurately and quickly type in like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in the order that they were in, whereas humans can't do that. Or there's like jays, like blue jays that can store caches of food over like hundreds or thousands of different locations and remember them. So I agree with David that there's no single measure of intelligence, but maybe it's useful to think of like specific tasks that things are better at or worse at. And so I think there it's like useful to look across nature. So for example, when I mentioned ant colonies, one thing that they're good at is being really robust. So you can like wipe out half of the colony or like 90% of the colony, and you still get some function of foraging for food or defending the colony. Whereas if you take something that's not distributed and wipe out 90%, it's usually not going to be functional. So I think there's different aspects of different biological systems that we can borrow from, and depending on what we want, like for example in finance or in other domains, we might be able to borrow bits and pieces from different systems to get the sort of traits that we want to get.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned one research project SFI we thought was very interesting, and that was Doan Farmer's market prediction algorithms when he was working with Prediction Company, where they developed what they called zero intelligence agents, if you remember. So essentially sort of first order Markov processes that outperformed a very large number of trading strategies. And what was interesting in that discovery, and I think it's very important, is that when the order book was instituted as the preferred trading strategy in the London Stock Exchange first, what it did was it actually outsourced memory. And so the cultural institution of the stock exchange was the random access memory, such that the trading strategy didn't have to have one. And so an understanding of the elements of a cognitive system can certainly help you in a more efficient development of a strategy, and I think most people don't think very carefully about that. The other one, I think, is in relation to biomimicry. I think that we all understand that Da Vinci was obsessed with bird wings, and Bernoulli's principle, much later, of course, coming out of an understanding of flying machines, organic flying machines. I think there are numerous principles of nervous action that we haven't even begun to explore, that will be essentially the next 100,000 years of mined material for quasi-intelligent mechanical systems or digital systems. I mean, when you think that deep neural networks are essentially, and I take David's point yesterday, they're quite complicated, but they're essentially architecturally complicated. And so they're moving towards nervous systems, but they're not dynamically very interesting. And they're also, I don't know how much people know here about the visual pathway, but they're very low grade in terms of their structure. They're not resembling what happens back here in primary visual cortex. So that kind of diversity, right? In other words, a deeper understanding. And then, as I said, I think if you remember in the early days of the space program where when NASA was placing non-human primates in warheads and rocket ships as controllers, and pigeons, which failed, which was quite interesting. I mean, there's an interesting question of whether or not you could place swarms in rocket ships as better controllers. And this sounds flip, but I don't think it is. Yesterday I mentioned to this crowd something that perhaps the practitioners don't know, and that is that the areas of the nervous system that we employ for mathematical reasoning are non-linguistic and shared with other non-human primates. So in principle, it would be possible to recruit other species to solve mathematical problems that we couldn't if we could only learn mentalese, right? In other words, if we could translate the problem into the appropriate neural code. And yesterday, Walter was talking about this in terms of single cells, and it's something that we've shared, a perspective we've shared for a long time, that it might be possible to build in beakers cellular computers that are solving a certain class of computational problem, not yet established what that class is, more effectively than digital computers. So that would be an example of that comparative approach.
So one issue here is how to get away, or why we come to rely on particular metrics and become sort of wedded to them. And there's a kind of lock-in issue here, and to illustrate the point, we can actually look at the collective intelligence literature. And the collective intelligence literature is largely on humans, and it generally is experimental and generally asks the question, how tall is the Eiffel Tower? And asks a group of people to estimate the height of the Eiffel Tower, or how many jelly beans are in this jar? And what happens then is that there's a consideration of how to integrate all the different estimates of the individuals, of the height of the Eiffel Tower, the number of jelly beans. And it's like the mean or a weighted mean and so forth. And then there's a proliferation of studies around this that sort of makes more small variation on that general theme of the mean being the important measure. But if you step back a little bit and you see the problem, from 20,000 feet, you realize that it's an information aggregation problem. And information aggregation is a problem that we see comes up in finance. It comes up in coordinating swarms of robots. It comes up in artificial intelligence and understanding how the neural nets are working. It comes up in web search, like when you are trying to find that that search term via Google, the algorithm Google's using to decide which page is the best or most appropriate page given your search. And when you look at it this way, you realize there's a huge family of algorithms that could be employed to measure what the consensus opinion is of the individuals or nodes in your system. And so you no longer, when you take that broader perspective, you no longer are stuck with this small set of measures.
I think, again, all of us in our different settings have seen this case, like, all you have is a hammer, you're just bashing around at everything, right? Whereas if you really step back and say, what tool do I need? What is the question I want to answer? Pause on that, and then equally pause on what's the tool that actually matches the question at hand. We very rarely do that. We just grab the thing that's on the shelf. And I think, again, that's true in lots of different disciplines. Related to that, we had a great strand of conversation yesterday related back just to some of the, I think some of the terminology and language you were using, but then also some of the substance underneath it. And so I'd love to explore a little bit further the distinctions between some terms that we use interchangeably. So pretty often, if someone says quantitative, they might equally mean logical, they might mean arithmetic, they might mean mathematical. And one thing I love about this group is that lots of people in this room will be able to finally parse those out in a way that I think is hugely valuable and important. And again, it's a little bit of precision in language. We're maybe imprecise in our language, and we're overly precise in some of the use of our tools, and it maybe should be the other way around. So I'm curious, just maybe start with social engineering, right? Because that's like such a flash word for folks. But I have an equal reaction when someone says, we need quantitative models of social systems. I just think, oh God, please don't. Mostly because the attempts so far have not been true attempts, right? And they have led to some pretty disastrous consequences. So talk a little more about what exactly you mean, and then we'll maybe broaden out to this mathematical quantitative.
Yeah, I guess the first point is to reiterate again that social engineering has obviously been going on for a long time. And the point I was largely making is that it has been, for the most part, based on rules of thumb and qualitative understanding and idiosyncratic data. Right, and the data hasn't really been it's been qualitative data too. And so we're moving into a phase where we have very good microscopic, data that can be numerical, and we have a better understanding of models that take us from the micro to the macro that are based both in theory and on observations. So we're sort of positioned to move from this qualitative rule of thumb based reactive to things we've seen, proactive social engineering that's quantitative, where we can reason quantitatively about situations we have not yet observed. Okay, so that's the sort of proactive part, and then there's the quantitative part. And quantitative, of course, as Catherine said, can mean many things. And I'm a pluralist, but I do truly believe that understanding in science comes from triangulating between the data, natural language, and mathematics. And so for me, a quantitative approach would be developing models that are empirical, but where the models, are mathematical and can be confirmed by moving between those mathematical models and natural language.
Awesome.
And I'm sure David and Albert have something
Absolutely,
they'd
yes.
like to add to that.
Do you want to add, David?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a very interesting internal debate at SFI, and it's, I know, also a debate in your world, Catherine, because sometimes articulated as the difference between value investors and quants, right? I mean, someone who actually understands how the world works as opposed to someone who's fiddling about in sort of the 20th decimal place at nanoseconds to make money. And I think, and it's not that different in science. I mean, there's a huge misconception. We're interested in it, and I think John actually talked about this yesterday, mathematics versus physics. SFI is interested in mathematics. Some of the applications of mathematics are done by physicists and some by biologists and others. And mathematics is not particularly quantitative. Topology is not particularly quantitative. Category theory is not particularly quantitative. Set theory is not particularly quantitative. The logical foundations of mathematics are not particularly quantitative. They can be made quantitative. And so there's a kind of misunderstanding, actually fundamental misunderstanding of what mathematics is. The quantitative dimensions have been typically adopted by physicists who are obsessed with back-of-the-envelope calculations. That is approximation. Mathematicians hate the idea of approximation. And so it's worth getting that right. And Murray used to always say, I mean, it's interesting, Murray Gell-Mann, who's one of the founders of SFI and an extraordinary theoretical physicist and other things, was always cautioning a sort of a premature quantification of a phenomenon before careful thought. And I think I've seen it over and over and over again at talks at SFI and elsewhere, where someone presents an utterly foolish quantitative model based on rigorous quantitative reasoning, which has absolutely nothing to do with the phenomena of interest. And there is no substitute for thought. And quantification is not a substitute for thought. And so I feel quite strongly about that. But in the end, you want to make predictions and test your theories. And that's where quantity comes into play in generating consensus. But premature quantification resembles something else that's premature. And it's rather unsightly.
I'm going to bring David to my next meeting with our risk team. So, did you want to comment on that, Albert? I have a question right up your alley. If you want. No, go for it. Okay, great. So the last bundle of things I wanted to address before we open to broader conversation is this link back between the scientific and the human, right? Jeffrey at one point yesterday said, we're the only ones who care. I would add, we're also the only ones who kind of invent our own fear. And so there's a power there, and there's also a fragility there in terms of what we're capable of as actual actors within this system. And so I have two elements to think about there. Albert, you mentioned crisis. It's a crisis discipline, right? To think about this intersection of biology activity and what's actually happening in the world right now. Whenever you're at that kind of intersection and it is a crisis, whether it's a true deep long-term crisis or just a feeling of crisis momentarily, you do also add this other element of what enables the best in human capacity and kind of growth on all the dimensions we've been talking about today, and what makes us just narrow our time horizons, narrow our focus. Sometimes that narrowness is necessary, as you mentioned, kind of fight or flight in the moment, but sometimes that's exactly the wrong thing we need. So can you talk about just the intersection of all those things, and we'll relate it back to question of artifacts.
With the thought of a crisis discipline is what you talked about with uncertainty. With science, when we gather data and have models, we naturally have measures of uncertainty and error bars and things like that. And I feel like there's some translation between that safe world where you can describe uncertainty and policy where you're codifying one specific, here's the best route. And I think that you have to shed some layers of the subtlety in the science when you translate into policy. And then maybe going for, do you not agree?
No, Dan's making
I think
faces at me.
Do you not
everyone's
agree?
agreeing, don't worry.
And then maybe one step further, when you communicate that to the public, then you lose even more.
Yeah.
And so I think some of my collaborators and I are arguing for the need of a crisis discipline, but I think that terrifies us to like push ourselves in that direction. How do we, for example, like what are the research priorities that we should have in order to maybe minimize those error bars as quickly as possible in the most important areas in order to make the best policy recommendations? Or is it a communication issue? Like, can we somehow educate the public better about uncertainty? I mean, I feel like our experience of the world is inherently uncertain, right? Like when we're going about our day, it's always probabilities and like Bayesian thinking, like underlying our cognitive processes. So, but then we're not really taught that in school at all. Like
Right.
none of our math classes really up through high school talk about uncertainty.
Yeah.
So I think there's like something fundamental missing in education that maybe could go some way to fixing that.
Yeah, it's another form of intelligence, right? Like another capacity, right, that can be cultivated over time, which is
Yeah.
really cool to think about. Yeah.
But I think you're right that it's very uncomfortable
yeah.
to
yeah.
hold like multiple possibilities in our mind.
Well, and we're coming back here to this push and pull between, simplicity that is clarity versus simplicity that's just simplistic, right? And I mean, for all of us, I think this is a big push and pull in our lives. This relates back, I think, to some of what David was referencing in thinking about artifacts and more broadly maybe to development of all types of technologies over time. We were discussing earlier navigation as an example, and this question that I'm not sure is always addressed on the front end. What are you giving up in the use of new artifacts? So we're actually pretty good navigators as physical creatures. We're less and less good rapidly as we're losing the training and the skills and the practice of all that. And maybe that doesn't matter in a wide range of circumstances, but maybe it will matter in a really meaningful, powerful way. And so, again, you could extrapolate that to all sorts of different technologies and areas. David, I'm wondering if to kind of round us out here before we open up, you could relate the question of artifacts, what we know on that front, and how it relates to
Yeah.
thinking about new technology more broadly.
Yeah, I did want to just reference Feynman, two quotes from Feynman. So, what is science? Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. And what is the value of science? The value of science is to learn to live with uncertainty. And that is what should be taught at schools. It's not. It's the inverted. Okay, so I just wanted to do a Feynman thing. On the artifacts thing, it's very interesting. The one thing we know about the nervous system and the genome, but more the nervous system, is that it is extraordinarily miserly with energy. And it will minimize its energy expenditure to the nth degree. And in fact, Chris, we were talking, knows my brother, and my brother's one of the his claims to fame is the only person that I know who's actually able to calculate the true trajectories of limbs in space based on an energy minimizing principle. So there is a reason why I grasp for this like that and not like that. And it's not time minimization. You can do experiments. It's energy minimization. And so if you give it an out by outsourcing a function, it will energy minimize and stop using it. And that's just a principle of nervous action. And there are beautiful examples from the history of life which show you, cave fish lose their eyes. They don't need them, and the brain that would process those signals goes away because the brain takes a lot of energy, and if it doesn't need to use it, it won't. And exactly the same thing is true in culture, I think, by extension. So I actually think the moral implication of that insight hasn't really been widely appreciated, or practical implication, that for every artifact that complements a cognitive ability, the long-term implication will be the withdrawal And it happens in molecular evolution too, right, over different timescales, something Ashley works on. Recently I read probably the most up-to-date meta-analysis of the implications of outsourcing on aging research. And so there are some very interesting results in relation to Alzheimer's, Huntington's, and Parkinson's disease, where you provide prosthetic support to aging patients and you accelerate the rate of cognitive loss. Right? Now, that's fine as long as they still have access to their iPhone. But if you take it away, what you've just done is, I think, what every doctor is told not to do. And so we are entering a complicated era, I think, in cognitive artifacts.
Well, this is a history of all disaster, right? Like, I thought I was helping is kind of the executive summary. So, Will, do you want to take us forward from there?
Yeah, let's actually open it up to the floor. Nicola, do you have something?
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick. I had a couple of comments. I'm curious. Very fascinating panel. One about artificial intelligence. I can't resist telling you, one of my favorite quotes was from Amos Tversky, who's, people in this group might know who he is, but he said when they asked him how do you study artificial intelligence, he says, no, I don't study artificial intelligence, I study natural stupidity.
Yeah.
Your point is.
Yeah.
Which I think is exactly the key point.
Yeah.
Another thing that I was wondering about in terms of what the panel thinks is this idea of modeling systems. So I have, my own background is pretty diverse. I did engineering, math, medicine, biology, etc. So in all of this, I found something very, to me, what's interesting is there was a mention of fluid dynamics, how you can model things as a fluid. Well, I did some fluid dynamics when I studied spider cell. And what was fascinating to me, let's say take this principle of fluid dynamics. So the basic principles are known for a while. We mentioned Bernoulli, we mentioned, there's other things like control volumes, very simple ways to attack problems. But out of this simple system, what's unknown is turbulence. Totally unsolved problem. Who knows if it'll ever be solved really? So to me, what I'm getting at here is, I feel like there's a growing trend because of the computational powers that have expanded. That people think, okay, well that was the piece that was missing, just the computational part. Well, it's actually to me the fundamental parts are missing. Like, how do you model like human greed into the equation? Like, that's what I think is the big problem of like in the industrial society, what's causing climate change and all of that is like, well, I don't see a model that says, oh, human greed is in this calculation and that's, the redistribution of wealth, etc. So I'm just curious what the panel thinks about, the dangers of using computational models without really understanding, with missing key ingredients. That's kind of my long vision.
I can take a shot at that sort of indirectly, which is I very much believe that the best way to go about understanding this relationship between micro and macro is to have good microscopic data, and you have some macroscopic targets, something you think is functionally important, and then you try and derive that macroscopic from an understanding of the microscopic. So I like the idea of having a lot of good microscopic data, and usually in the systems that we work on, that's strategic data on the kinds of probabilistic data on the decision-making rules and strategies that the components are using, that take seriously the errors and information processing limitations that they have. So it's not just like in the fluid dynamics case, it's not like we just take this model seems like it will work on this system and we apply it. We go from the micro, we try to derive the macro from the micro, and we have this complicated map, and then we do dimension reduction on it to identify like the most important features at that mesoscopic level. And then that starts to be our theory. So in the fluid dynamics case, the reason I provided that as an example is because it suggests that in some cases, going to the mesoscopic right away and not going down to the microscopic is possible. And I don't think that's going to be the case for many systems. And the second reason I mentioned it is because if we do build a mesoscopic model either that way or in the way that I suggested through dimension reduction, the nice thing about it is it means that we may not have to then in the future pay attention to the individual level details. And that's both good from the point of view of science in some sense and also good from the point of view of social engineering, because it allows, as I said, potentially the individual and collective trade-offs to both be handled. So in other words, we don't have to worry so much or care what the individuals are doing. They're free to do what they want. We can focus on our nudging at that sort of mesoscopic level.
So you're kind of thinking like conservation of mass, like I said, at the control volume, where you care what's happening at the boundaries, you don't really care what happens individually, based on some principle, some guiding principle. Is that kind of where you're heading, like conservation of mass or energy?
Yeah, I mean, from the point of view of like having an efficient predictive theory, yes, and also from the sort of kind of normative point of view of not having to worry about individual privacy, that might be nice too. But the question is how you get there. Do you have to get there by going through the microscopic and doing the dimension reduction, or can you go right to the mesoscopic? And it becomes a really important question when you're working on, say, the brain, which has 86 billion neurons, and mapping all of the neural connections is, one, untractable, and two, maybe very undesirable.
And it's funny, I'll give you an example, I think, and people have heard me rant about this before. I don't have enough money to fly my own plane, or be flown around in my own plane, better yet. And so I go to airports, like most of us, and I'm boarded in this most ignominious fashion onto the plane, and it takes forever. And of course, what is this boarding thing? So of course you can go and look up the literature on the history of boarding schedules, and it turns out that nearly all of them, you can do it. I did it. And if you do this, you find out that almost every boarding schedule with respect to its utility function, let's say minimizing the time it takes to board, is worse than random. So in other words, if you just said, storm the plane, right, you'd board more quickly. I mean, you might hurt somebody. And so there's been a lot of work on this. And in fact, I read a paper, it came out a few years ago, where they compared a whole range of different strategies. So actually, that institution is stupid. That's what I mean by stupidity. And that algorithm, that rule system is stupid. And I think that's the thing that we get trained as a scientist, and I'm sure everyone in this room in business.
Escalators are another nice
Example of something.
where they hold the switch to try to make people not walk on the left.
Right. And now they've got congestion or something.
No, it's
It works
quicker.
better.
It was better.
Okay.
But actually just having people stand and wait.
Oh, that's interesting.
Full
Yeah.
capacity.
But that's sort of exactly that kind of idea.
But
Yeah.
on the other hand,
Yeah.
it depends what you're trying to optimize.
It depends entirely what you're trying to optimize.
Because
But that needs to be stated.
boarding is something to do with social structure and interaction and comfort.
No, but that's the key.
Fair price.
Yeah.
Particularly, what happens if you try to optimize many different things?
That's right.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what
Not
I'm
just
saying.
what you optimize,
That's right.
how many things,
That's right.
because you might end up.
So there now is an extensive literature on precisely that, and but it's interesting that one should know it. One should know what the utility function is, and one should have an appropriate null model. I just want to make that point that if someone ever gives you a story on this is what they're doing and how they've improved something, it is absolutely an obligation on your part to say what is the control and what is the null. And because if they just have a result that looks to you like a good one, it's meaningless. And so, yeah.
Let's do Dan and then Yarrow.
Yeah.
Very briefly on that.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. I suspect if you went into some of the airlines' dark rooms, they were more aware of those trade-offs than you might think.
Possibly.
And they had other objectives. They didn't really care about optimizing the time to board. They cared about making sure their premier passengers felt good, etc.
Yeah, I think that might be true. But so long as we know.
And those are, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I
Well,
just want
can
to go
I-
back to what Albert said though earlier.
Yeah.
Jeff did see me jumping together. My comment to Albert is, you know what? Science is part of the social system. And you don't live in an ivory tower. And just get over it. I'm sorry that sounds dismissive, but it is, and it's intended to be, because you know what? Those of us who are in science areas that are inherently political and of great interest to society have been dealing with this for a long time. And by the way, so were scientists in World War II in the Manhattan Project. So the idea that scientists should be completely outside of society and yet ask for support, ask for research funding from society, expect that kind of reverence and respect you know, it's not a rational view of the way science actually works. And so the
Yeah.
answer is, you do have to occasionally put up walls, and you have to handle it, and make sure that you don't let political ideologies interfere with your analyses and your conclusions, et cetera. You have lots of checks and balances on that. But, you know, if there are social applications of your science, so be it. Just understand that you don't necessarily get to decide, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think one thing I was trying to argue is that maybe, I think if you asked, say, like, social network researchers what the top 5 things that are most important to study right now are, they aren't the same things as if you ask, like, well, what are the 5 next things we should study in order to make the best policy recommendations? And so I think it's like a change of perspective on what our priorities should be.
Right, and you know what? In every field, I think this is true. There is a range of questions and a range of communities that go from very, very pure to very, very applied. And questions change, priorities change, interests change as you cross that spectrum. But I would argue that in almost every field it's a continuum. I don't believe that there are scientists and engineers. I actually think people can define themselves that way, but I think just about everybody falls into a continuum.
Yeah.
And over your career, you may choose to become more applied and then actually retreat a little bit. I'll tell you just personally, when I started working in Washington during the Obama years, I was spending, 30% of my time doing hyper-applied stuff because, we were actually working with the President of the United States. My own research back here drifted backwards in geologic time. I got much more interested in the Proterozoic and evolution of atmospheric oxygen and coevolution of animals. Things that I would say had zero policy relevance at all. And I think that was a sort of subconscious, intentional response
Yeah.
which tried to balance my life. As I was getting hyper involved in very relevant applied things, my research sort of protected my mind a little bit in more irrelevant areas. That was a good thing.
Good.
And I'm shifting back a little bit.
Let's do Yarrow and then Walter.
I'm one of the fun guys in the room. One thing I've noticed,
But do you beat the index fund?
Everyone here does.
find benchmarking. Focus on,
I'm just teasing.
I think in my 15 years of my career, I've noticed the more information we have in front of us, the more we rely on narratives and stories to handle and deal with it. And I'm not sure if the systems that we have to understand our knowledge have kind of kept up with the scale of, sorry, I'm phrasing it, but it feels like the scale of the information we're consuming right now is maybe beyond what the historical analysis of our cognition has dealt with, perhaps. So do you feel like this leads on a system level to a decline in collective intelligence on a system level, and more driven by narratives, which in turn has an impact on influencing the scientific agenda and all these other things? So I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think most of what we're dealing with is noise. And what's interesting is a tiny, tiny fraction of all the garbage that we're fed on a daily basis. And I think that there's all this sort of breathless hyperbole about the special nature of the world. And I think it's true that the special nature of the world is just more noise. But I'm a very strong advocate of the condensation through narrative. I think that much of the science that you're hearing, Jeffrey's book, Jeffrey wrote his book Scale without one equation in it, right? And he was told not to. And it's the most influential thing he ever did. It is. Now, of course, that was fed, it was fed, after, I've got the mic, not to say that it wasn't based on real rigorous mathematical work. But it's interesting, but that's a very important point. And that's to the question, the most comprehensible thing he ever did. And I think it represented a genuinely difficult distillation of complicated mathematical ideas into narrative form, which then are consequential. So I'm 100% supporter of narrative argument. I think it's actually the ultimate test of many of our ideas, not the kind of quantitative gobbledygook that's encoded in deep neural networks.
One possibility, though, in response to your question, which is very interesting, it's something I've been kind of an idea I've been playing with, but I really don't know if this is right. It's just that in the past, one of the cognitive challenges was in inference, inferring, because there are lots of gaps in our knowledge and gaps in our data. We had smaller data, and now and this is somewhat related to what David said, and now the challenge is filtering. So we went from having to do this inference and estimate missing data to getting rid of the noise.
Mm-hmm. I think of that Eliot poem all the time, right? Like, where is the wisdom lost in understanding? Where is the understanding lost in data, right? Like, there's this Maslow's hierarchy. You've got data, information, knowledge, understanding, wisdom up here. And the bottom of the pyramid, to your point, has grown exponentially. The top, not so much. But you don't know what's noise until you spend the time sifting through it. So that's a great challenge.
Let's
To
do.
every side.
Can I say
Yeah.
just quickly? And this is a challenge also in a lot of animal collectives. Say for like a school of fish, if you're trying to detect and escape a predator, then if like one fish like freaks out, like every other fish might want to freak out, right? But then that could be really noisy because like any one fish has like all the power to like disrupt the whole school. So it's like this difficult problem of like how do you amplify signals that are really important, like the presence of a predator, but also dampen noise due to some erratic, like crazy individual or whatever. And so, and especially if you have like a large group, then there's more individuals and so more possibilities for noise. So I think it's a common problem in nature, and there's different solutions that have come up. And like the solution might depend on where you fall on that speed accuracy trade-off. So if you just really don't want to get eaten by a predator, you might tolerate a large amount of noise and just startle tons of times every day, but then you definitely don't get eaten. But so it depends like what you're trying to optimize. But this is also like really common in nature.
Let's do Walter and then John.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can articulate it well. I know, this is a foreign language to me. So,
Say it in Italian.
also foreign language. In fact, that's perhaps the point, that the discussion about intelligence is revolving around sort of representation as a central, as an anchoring concept. It's as if all intelligence is representational in one way.
One dimension.
But I was reading this interesting book by Andrew Pickering on cybernetics, the history of cybernetics, where people they built these machines, like early precursors of Rodney Brooks and so forth, Ashby, Haas, these people, and these machines were exceedingly complex, but they didn't really compute anything because there was no representation you could ascribe to them or that you could recognize them having come out of the world. So he makes this distinction between performative and representational. So he calls them performative machines. And he argues, that he had Pickering argues that he had a satisfactory performative relationship to doorknobs long before he understood how a doorknob works. So I wonder whether, maybe science has succeeded so well that it has blinded us to, a large swath of intelligence, for lack of a better word, that is not representational. So the fact that we use language to communicate, as you perhaps mentioned already, it does by no means imply that we think linguistically. What goes on in our brain might be a completely different paradigm that is then sequentialized because parsing in sort of a time series is easier than something wildly concurrent. So language is a kind of a necessity, but not reflective of how we think.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but very briefly, this is a longer thing at lunch, perhaps. But this has a very long history. It goes, and as you know, I mean, this was the big behaviorist versus cognitive science debate. The behaviorists denied representation. That's what Skinner did very famously. He said, just black box. And then we discovered all sorts of interesting encodings. I think they're not at odds. I mean, the whole move towards embodied cognition, which is a move away from the central nervous system, but it's not a move away from representation. It's just saying that you can outsource to kinematics. And so I'm at pains to make the point that linguistic representation is a teeny, 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 weeny, insignificant fraction of what the nervous system represents. But I definitely think of it as encoding, and I think where the field of embodied cognition has moved, and in things like Nihat's morphological computation, is towards representation of motor systems, kinematics. Still representational, it's just not neural.
Can you see with the non-representation? Is intelligence sort of the flip side of representation, or representation?
No. No.
What would be non-representation?
Well, I actually think the way I would put it is, so this is again a slightly more philosophical point, is to what extent does the system, the representation, reflect the physics and structure of the world in which it lives? And representations can be thought of as mirrors. And that's the way I would think about representation. To the extent that the physical architecture is a reflection of gravity, of the structure of the world, it's a representation because it's a reflection.
Well, aren't you saying that if there's a one-to-one mapping, it's not a very interesting representation?
Yeah, it's definitely not
And
one-to-one.
then you might add
Yeah.
that if the representation changes very fast, it's a very fast time scale, it's also not that interesting. And so in the embodied cognition work, there were plenty of embodied cognition researchers who dispensed with AI, symbolic AI, and representation, and thought it wasn't unnecessary, which seems to be silly.
Yeah.
But there is a graded issue here. So if it's very fast and a close to one-to-one mapping, then it doesn't seem that useful.
Yeah. Yeah.
John?
Yeah. I had a question for Jess. I thought, by the way, all the presentations were very stimulating. But Jess, it sounded to me like you were a little too pessimistic. You're setting the horizon so far out, and probably it comes from your thinking about a different kind of problem than I'm thinking about. So you were talking about social engineering, and you said it's been done, lots of it's been done, although not very well, but some of it seems to be working pretty well. I mean, the Federal Reserve manages the interest rate from day to day, and they do it on the basis of a model which takes into account that if they change something, people are going to react differently, and so it's they're modeling a complex adaptive system in designing their policy. We have laws against monopoly, not based typically on a model of all the details of what's going on, but a general idea that comes from a model that monopoly is harmful. We've got, we set taxes on polluters, and so we do a whole lot of engineering that seems to work at least part of the time. Doesn't always work. We have crises and crashes and things like that because the Fed, in my view, the Fed doesn't take into account enough variables, or even the right variables, but at least it does something, social engineering in a positive direction. So when you set this 80 or 100-year horizon, what is the kind of problem that you're thinking of that is going to take us so long to get to?
Well, I mean, so there's two responses to that. First is that I think the Fed is a good example, although it's my understanding that nobody predicted, for example, negative interest rates, which is sort of part of that discussion, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so building on that a little bit, and you're the expert, so you say more in a second. I think we think we're doing well in these cases, but coming back to David's point, we often don't ask how well are we doing above a null. So maybe a lot of our doing well is actually luck.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, sounds like platitudinous, but it's actually a really important concern.
No, a lot of economists say that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm not convinced, as a scientist, that we have measured how well we're doing well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think that's an open discussion. But you could prove me wrong and show that, in fact, some of these social engineering things, and interesting, the ones you've mentioned are at the more mesoscopic level.
Yes, they're all
And so it
mesoscopic.
might be something, if they are actually skillful, then there might be something about those problems that lends themselves to that type of going right to the mesoscopic scale, as I discussed earlier. And it might be the problems that are sort of outside of that we find most challenging, right? So that's a partial answer. And so, in terms of my 50 to 80 year time horizon, I think to do this well, we have to, have good null models for our performance. I think we need that strategic statistical mechanics, which is non-trivial. I'm not sure really what that means. I can enumerate a set of things that it needs to incorporate, and it, I shouldn't maybe call it just strategic statistical mechanics. I think it's going to take theoretical computer science and information super seriously too, so it might need another name altogether, and that's going to take a long time to build. And then I think, what we're after is sort of a really good scientific understanding of, a predictive understanding of where to intervene in the system, what the dominant causal features are. It seems to me that's going to take a long time.
Especially because probably there will be feedback on our knowledge too. I mean, first of all, there's plenty of, I think you have to recognize that. So, for example, there was work done by Edward Teller in the late 40s. He was very concerned about nuclear attacks on U.S. cities. And so he's wrote papers to economists arguing for a checkerboard country, and arguing that if you built highway systems, you would dilute the cities into suburbs, and you would spread people out and make them less vulnerable to attack.
Hence the highway system.
And that was part of the justification for Eisenhower's Defense Act and Transportation Act that led to our highway system. It's a little dark side that Edward Teller was involved with that, but it's true. And so part of the suburbanization of America, which has some good things and some bad things, was actually intentional because of the Cold War. Would you call that social engineering? He had a particular model and a particular set of priorities and a particular set of values, and he had a prediction of what was going to happen. Maybe it doesn't meet your standard for being quantitative, but the question is, things like that are going to happen here, around the world, continually, and the question is how are data, statistics, and models and theory going to contribute to them over time? And I would say it's going to be a continuum. It's not going to be. You're creating a bit of a false dichotomy.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think an interesting question is to examine the history and ask whether we can see, looking back, a kind of phase transition, or whether it was more continuous in terms of going from this quantitative qualitative to quantitative. That's an interesting historical question. But I think with the convergence of those things that I enumerated, we are potentially entering a new, maybe not a new phase, but a new period in history in terms of what's possible. It didn't take a long time, I think, but I think it is new.
I thought, I just finished my question. I thought you were going to, sorry, be quick. I thought you were going to answer my question by saying you were interested in a broader question, like the interaction of politics and economics and, and the media. And when you put all those things together, the social engineering is just much more complex, and we've got no idea what's happening. Is that part of?
Part of it is certainly this recognition that the room has made that we're optimizing on multiple functions.
Yeah.
Right, and now we have to start taking that seriously. Right, so that is definitely part of the story, and that related to that is this idea that there are going to be lots of different groups capable of social engineering. And maybe in the past, it was a few individuals or powerful leaders or who could make these decisions, but now it's going to be various corporations, different countries, like in the climate case, adversarial climate change, and that adds more coupling to the system. And so, we assume that when we think about these kinds of things, that life is going to get simpler, we're going to have a better understanding, but it might be that all this intervention just leads to, even if it's more quantitative, a mess.
So,
Actually, on those lines.
So Ross had a.
That's okay. I was just going to say that on those lines, and actually to agree. Channeling John, there's a very famous, I think Lucas won a Nobel, right?
Lucas, yeah.
Yeah, the Lucas critique. That one way things will get more complicated, and this has been recognized for a while, is that when people know that the regulator is going to be anticipating what they're going to do and are building that in, Basically, what you do from a game theory perspective is now you expand the game to include the regulator, which makes the control problem of the regulator at least naively more complicated, but of course it begs the question if somehow that can be exploited to actually try to simplify things. So to add some more examples to these kinds of things, if you look at systems like bonds, what you can actually do is you can do an analysis to see that when actually a group, a small governmental entity or a large one, takes on bonds, that's actually what's going on at a group level is that you are collectively agreeing to actually lose some funding now for a social good at the end. And there's all kinds of literature about what kinds of things should go into bonds, that it should actually be for things like physical improvements rather than for operating expenses and so on. But there are all these kinds of things where almost at a political economic level, and there is a large field of political economics. I don't know how much it has to say on those specific issues. There is a nexus, to use David's words, in which people determine what kind of bonds and future spending you can actually get past the electorate. One fascinating and not necessarily in a good way example of this is the Republicans. The deficit hawks just very gladly did this I think it's probably the most massive stimulus package in history by far, with nary a thought to the issue of what happens long term. Do you have to pay this back or not? And in economics, there's right now some controversy about, well, are deficits actually bad or not? Which all comes into this kind of an issue very much in this one narrow domain.
Yeah, I mean, John and David, these are excellent points, and I think one thing this raises is we have to think hard, given that there are multiple functions and we might not agree on them, that we might have to optimize, whether our social engineering should be on things like robustness as opposed to particular outcomes like distribution of inequality, right? So then we sort of are optimizing many fewer things, and we're sort of investing in a kind of process as opposed to particular forms that society might take.
Yeah, and to touch on it very, very quickly on a question that was raised before concerning that, is that in many control theory problems, you want to actually steer the system to a suboptimal point if you actually reduce your posterior uncertainty, because you're actually interested in outliers, which you can try to build into the objective function sometimes, and things like that. So that gets back to the whole issue of uncertainty. There's a reason why humans have a large part of what behavioral game theorists call uncertainty aversion. They've learned.
We will regroup here at 2 p.m. for our next panel. So let's thank our panelists again. And go eat.
Thank you very much. Thank you.